Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. A powerful blast hit the road and rail bridge linking Russia and the Crimean Peninsula on Saturday. The bridge is a crucial supply route for Russian forces in Ukraine. 2 days later, several explosions hit Ukraine's capital. Do these signify a turning point in Russia-Ukraine conflict? Worse hostilities to come? Let's loop in our panelists. For the latest discussion, let's go to Yuval Weber from Washington, D.C. He's the research assistant professor at Texas A&M University Bush School of Government and Public Service. In Shanghai, we have Professor Zhao Long from the Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. What is the latest offering of air defense support from the United States to Ukraine? Mr. Weber.
So certainly, earlier this evening, at least Washington time, the White House, in terms of President Biden and President Zelensky of Ukraine, had a conversation, and the White House readout, the summary of what they discussed, is that President Biden expressed support for Ukraine, for Zelensky, expressed sympathy for the victims of the bombings earlier today, and said that advanced air defense systems would be provided to Ukraine. They did not specify exactly what that is, and that's something that we can expect more information, more clarity from the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, that is, over the course of the next week, so that Ukraine is better able to defend itself going forward.
Do you see an escalation of tensions as a result of the latest bombing of Kiev?
Sure, I think we are witnessing the very significant escalation of situation. I think that the events of the past few days and weeks have shown that the so-called hybrid warfare has become the key part of this conflict. That both sides are trying to open up new front in addition to the Donbass. We've seen the blast of the Nord Stream pipelines, Crimea bridge, and etc. I think the current conflict will be maybe develop into a new phase, or maybe set up a new normal in which some of the previous rules of engagement be completely overturned, including restrictions regarding the strikes on the critical civilian infrastructures such as power stations, transportation hubs, telecommunication systems as well. So we also may be seeing the degree of tolerance of civilian casualties caused by military actions to be further developed. So I think this kind of escalation of conflicts is something unavoidable, and two sides may fall into the vicious circle of mutual retaliation. And more so-called terrorist attacks may appear in the short terms on non-military targets. In general, I think the so-called collateral damages from the escalation of conflict may further intensify.
Mr. Weber, do you see an escalation both of the intensity of tensions and also the military actions by both sides, and probably by even more than both sides?
No, certainly I agree with my colleague in that where this war started, about 8 months ago at this point, people thought, analysts thought it was going to be quite violent. But the fact that it's been very violent from the beginning and hasn't really let up in the preceding 8 months, we've now gone to the point, where did Russia start? Where did Ukraine start? Both of them now, in effect, have to rely on the total defeat of the other side in order to survive.
How do you see the next stage of military conflicts between the two sides, especially when the word nuclear has been mentioned?
I believe that as long as Russia is not completely defeated on the battlefield, the use of nuclear weapons or WMD, the weapon of mass destruction, is unlikely, especially to use so-called tactical nuclear weapons. I think the boundaries of nuclear war remain for all parties. For Russia in particular, I think the preparedness of the nuclear weapons is mainly used to deter NATO to prevent the alliance from escalating the scale and the level of military assistance to Ukraine.
Why is the U.S. trying to play the so-called the card of nuclear, despite of the fact there has been a lot of rhetoric coming out of Moscow on nuclear?
So sure. So I think your response is actually exactly why this issue is so difficult to think about in the short term as well as into the long term. These issues can define, for the rest of this century, for generations to come, how international politics works, how certain states or areas, can be governed. And that's why at least the leadership in Washington is trying to ensure that nuclear weapons don't get used, so that the use of nuclear weapons, as threatened, over the last couple of weeks by Moscow, does not then reshape international relations in a direction or a level that becomes very difficult for all states of the world to control or to maintain. And I think that's the key non-proliferation message that Washington is trying to put forward, is that the use of nuclear weapons by Moscow will have consequences that no one quite yet knows or understands. That's the reason that Moscow shouldn't use them.
The energy crisis that's likely to take place in Europe during the winter time is going to put a lot of salt to the discussion. Now, how do you see the discussion, the nature of it, and also the likely results?
Well, I think the possible result, the end game of this conflict, is quite difficult to predict at the current stage. But for Russian leadership, after the so-called referendum, I think the special military operation has essentially become a war, maybe a war on terror or a war of homeland defense. So Russia has left no other choice but to continue at any cost. But this kind of outcome is also unacceptable for President Zelensky and Ukraine government. So I think with those vicious circle of retaliation, with this increased hatred and hostility between the Russian and Ukrainian peoples, and further, it will further eliminate the possible space for any kind of negotiation. Mm-hmm. And due to the civilian casualties caused by this round of Russian attack, and those nationalism, patriotism in Ukraine may turn into the support for President Zelensky. It also weakened the willingness maybe of the Europe to mediate and to restart negotiation process under the pressure of so-called energy crisis.
Well, how do you see, Mr. Weber, the role of this issue, the Russian-Ukraine crisis, on the politics of President Biden and also the Democrat Party for the midterm election, which means what the U.S. might be doing in the next couple of weeks before the election?
So certainly, United States, like People's Republic of China, are very wealthy countries. So these are not like huge amounts in the big picture. The Department of Defense, its budget is $800 billion. So $3 billion is it's a lot of money to you and me, but not a lot of money to the U.S. military. Ukraine has turned into one of the very, very, very few issues in which there is partisan agreement between the Republicans and Democrats, because this cuts across party lines, it cuts across generations. People like to support a winner, and that's what Ukraine looks like. There's a lot of latent hostility towards Russia going back many decades. So people within Washington and across the United States, and the public opinion surveys are pretty consistent, support Ukraine. So the Congress is willing to more or less do whatever President Biden wants on this particular issue. The issues that basically define every US election, people like us are really concerned about foreign policy, but it's always domestic issues, the pocketbook type things. And there was a big controversy over gasoline prices for cars maybe a couple months ago, but that was more or less resolved. And that was the major issue for the Democrats, of people being concerned about the conflict in Ukraine, what was happening to oil supplies around the world, and the effects at home. That doesn't seem to be as much of an issue. So of course, it's all the other, many issues that divide Americans that will help decide what happens at the ballot box. Not as much Ukraine as I see it.
Yuval Weber, Zhao Long, gentlemen, thank you so much.